Travis Roeder, SicEm365.com college football analyst, joins us as we have talked to Ricky Thompson, among others, to look ahead to Baylor. And now one of the stories today, Kyron Drones has entered the transfer portal, says he's still keeping his options open about Baylor, but usually that's not the case. Although Katie Davis of North Texas, the All-American candidate at linebacker we had on earlier, decided to stay at North Texas. Travis, how does this affect, you think, the quarterback room? We know Shapen, we know Novosad. Your thoughts about Kyron Drones?
Well, I mean, I was disappointed to see it. I think just from what I know about him as a prospect, and he's still young, I think I would love to have him back on the team, and I imagine the coaching staff would too. I just want to. I hope you didn't jinx things there with saying that we've got Novosad, the Smoky, and that I guess I'll wait till signing day to make sure that's ironclad. I know all indications there are that is the way it is, but you never know until the signature's on the line. So we'll see there. But obviously it creates an interesting situation for the spring where, and for the bowl game, honestly, where basically they have one scholarship quarterback on the roster right now. And then if Novosad signs and comes for the spring, they'll really only have two. And one of those being a true freshman. And the other one is a guy in Shapen who I think has had not the season that we had hoped for him. And so, I think, if Austin Novosad comes in the spring, it probably will be a true QB competition, but just between those two guys. So you've got to imagine, I do not think that they would go into the spring with only those two quarterbacks. I think they're going to be looking to add somebody in the portal. That's not me reporting anything. It's just kind of me using somewhat common sense. I don't think they would take anybody just to have a warm body, but I imagine they're going to want to have more competition than just a couple of scholarship quarterbacks. Maybe that waits until after next spring. But I imagine that, if Kyron elects not to come back to Baylor, then that'll probably be the direction that they're looking.
Do you think, and this kind of goes into maybe why he's trying to find a different fit, but that their scheme this year, just didn't fit the guys that they have, or the guys that they have didn't buy completely into the scheme?
Okay, so I think they were in a kind of a tough position in the sense of, Kyron is not the pure runner that I think a lot of fans have made him out to be. I get a lot of comments from people saying, like, why don't we put Kyron in there and run the Gary offense and just run the ball? I mean, he's as he showed in that West Virginia game, he's got some great arm talent. He's got a big arm. He's just more inaccurate than Blake is. And so I think it was kind of I think the system fits them both. I think the difficulty that the coaching staff is having right now is in how you want to be able to sell the type of system that you're running for recruits. And obviously not just for the recruits. I mean, they think it's the best offensive system. So, but I think they kind of got caught in a quandary with Gary where they said, look, we can run things back with Gary this year, but it's going to involve running the quarterback a lot. That's not the kind of quarterback we want to recruit to. So, it's a tension between what do we do that's now to try and create the best possible team at this moment versus what do we want to build for towards the future. So I imagine that was kind of what went into the factor that was the factor that went into what they decided to do this year when they picked Shapen over Gary. And I imagine as well with not giving Kyron too many reps this year. I'm sure that if he deserved the reps, he would have earned them. Again, that's what's very hard to speculate. Whenever you're an outsider speculating on whether a backup who hasn't played much should be playing, you don't really know how they're practicing. But just from what I saw when I was able to go to the open portions of practice, Kyron's very impressive physically. He's got a great arm, but he was noticeably less accurate than Shapen. Shapen was really on the money with a lot of those throws on the move. And I think we saw this year his struggle has been, okay, he's really good on the move, but what happens when he sticks in the pocket? That was a bit of a meandering answer, but I think that basically they're trying to move towards a system where they want Blake to play better from the pocket. Guys like Novosad should be really good from the pocket, and that's the system they're moving towards in the future.
Travis, what surprised you most about the 6-6 record?
Yeah, Craig, I feel like you should be a little bit meaner to me. I mean, my goodness, I was way out on a limb there. I said 11-1. Baylor wasn't even close. I think you were one of the more quote unquote pessimistic people out there, and you were at 8 wins. So, yeah. I mean, even you ended up being an optimist. I think what surprised me most is just what I really took for granted was Craig, we've been out there since this spring and fall listening to Aranda, and he talked about since this spring. He was like, hey, it almost felt like no matter the question a reporter asked him, he would kind of end up veering off towards leadership, culture, toughness, weathering the storm. Those were all the kind of analogies we heard him use since the spring. And I think what the mistake I made was that assuming that just because Aranda had kind of identified that as a problem, that it would be fixed. And I think that what we saw is just they were never really able to come up with an answer to that issue. And so that's why I'm very eager to watch this offseason as to what changes do they make on the roster. I think you're going to see a good amount of turnover on the roster itself. Adding guys from the portal, adding new recruits for their, this is only Aranda's second full recruiting class that's about to come in. And then potentially some changes on the coaching staff, because it's pretty rare for any team to go through an off season without at least a change or two from assistants. And especially after a 6-6 disappointing season, I imagine we'll see at least a change or two. So I think it was that lack of ability to kind of find that it factor that surprised me the most. But perhaps it shouldn't have, after basically all of those guys who generated that it factor last year left the team.
Travis Roeder, SicEm365.com with this college football analyst. I want to try to position this question fairly. They have not had what you would consider an elite quarterback. Charlie Brewer's second year was pretty good. Third year was pretty good, but not elite. And then we know what 2020 was a disaster. Bohannon was the perfect bus driver and was the leader without question in that for that team. They've now lost Zeno, Gary Bohannon, and Kyron Drones. And we don't know what the future is, and Austin Novosad should sign sometime here in the next 2 or 3 weeks. Is that a sign of quarterbacks who are confused with what Baylor's running with Grimes and Bell? What does all this mean, in your opinion, or is this just college football today?
Well, I think it's the context there. It is college football today. I think it's very, very difficult for staff to keep a consistent kind of, hey, we're going to take a quarterback every year. Maybe we'll lose one every few years, but we're always going to have at least 4 scholarship quarterbacks on the roster. That's becoming more and more difficult. And then I think with Baylor's situation specifically, I mean, you think about going from Rule and Jeff Nixon's system in 2019 to the Larry Fedora, Jorge Munoz non-system of 2020, and then, changing things over with Bell and Grimes, and kind of what I talked about earlier in the sense of, I really feel like they kind of viewed Gary as almost like a stopgap in the sense that he was absolutely what was best for that 2021 team, but was not the vision for the kind of quarterback they wanted to use for the system in the future. So I think it's been a bit of a mix up there. But I think it's like you said, Smoke, it's just really hard to keep a full room these days because the grass is always greener. It's really easy for somebody to be in your ear in the sense of, hey, did you see that there's a totally open job at X, Y, and Z school? And that's the thing about these guys. These are all competitors. These are all guys who were probably the best player on their high school team. And they believe in their ability to go compete and win anywhere they go. So I think that's the tough aspect of it. But I don't really think it says too much about Bell and Grimes at this point because the situation that they walked into coming off of the Larry Fedora situation with COVID and everything like that. I mean, they elected not to take a quarterback last year, in large part to land Austin Novosad. So I think, he's really their first QB recruit. And so I think what he ends up doing over the coming years is going to tell a lot about what they want from the quarterback position.
All right, Travis, I'm going to give you the credit card. And you're going to go to the transfer portal store.
Oh, man.
And you have to prioritize what you buy at the transfer portal store.
And unlike the real transfer portal, everything's in stock at this transfer portal store.
Yeah. So if everything is in stock, what are you going for down the list?
Yeah, so, I mean, I think part of it depends on, does Kyron end up leaving? I think, like I said, you can't enter a season with 2 scholarship quarterbacks and one of them being a true freshman. That's really an untenable position. I say you can't, and then maybe it'll happen. So we'll see. But I think that if Kyron ends up leaving, they got to take somebody. After that, I think it'll be really interesting to see how many guys does Baylor end up losing. I think they're in a position where, as fans, we should we've kind of taken pride in over the past years in the fact that Baylor has had barely anybody leave. I think it says a lot about Baylor as a university that a lot of these kids want to end up sticking around. But there's definitely some dead weight on this roster. And I think they could settle to lose, a solid 7, 8, 9, 10 guys. And I think they're going to need to, because if they're going to want to be able to add more than 1 or 2 players, and we saw that this past season where they were only able to add 2 players in the transfer portal, and that was mostly just because of scholarship numbers. I mean, you only have 85 scholarships. And so I think if they're going to be able to add more than 1 or 2, they got to lose some guys. But more directly to your question, a lot depends on whether TJ Franklin and Gabe Hall come back on the defensive line. I think if you get both of those guys back, it makes the defensive lineman addition much less of a necessity. I still think they'll be looking at that spot, but it makes it less of like oh my goodness, you absolutely must take 1 or 2 guys there, because they're graduating like 6 of their top 7 guys. It's crazy. So after that, though, one of the positions I have my eyes on is the defensive backfield. And I don't really care about them adding the most athletic stud who's going to step in and be a first-team all-conference guy. But one thing that's really disappointed me when I watched Baylor this year is I feel like they just don't really have a feisty enforcer on the back end. They don't have a Chris Miller who's going to fly downhill and pop you in the mouth and play aggressive. And so I think a lot of times what we've seen is these kids from like a group of 5 schools who may not have the full-on NFL athleticism. Baylor has plenty of NFL caliber athlete defensive backs on the team right now, but they're not playing up to snuff. And so I think I'd like to see them take somebody who maybe has a little bit of Taylor Young in him, where he doesn't necessarily have all the measurables, but he plays like a dog. So I think kind of on both sides of the ball, and I think that kind of goes for wide receiver as well. Baylor's had a bunch of guys who are 6'2" and run in the 4.4s, but they could use a Drew Estrada. I mean, they could use somebody who's just productive and knows how to play the position. So skill athletes on both sides of the ball. I think if they can take somebody who's productive, improven, and plays with an attitude, that'll go a long way.
Travis, as good as Shapen was against Oklahoma State in the championship game, and there were times this year he was really good, and then there were times when it was not good. Sometimes his fault, sometimes not. You hear about what Max Duggan was a couple of years ago. Different style. Duggan's a runner. He's physical. He's got a really nice arm. Shapen has his
Charlie
traits.
Burr with an arm.
Yes, exactly. He's fearless. And you wish maybe Blake on a few occasions this year would have been, but he wasn't. Can you see him developing? What do you see as his upside in Blake Shapen?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I was thinking about it today as I kind of rewatched the Texas game more closely and rewatched these last few weeks. I think it's important to parse out what Shapen is really good at versus what he's been poor at. And I think it's pretty clear at this point that, he's likely not an NFL quarterback. And, I hope that doesn't hurt anybody's feelings, but that's just the case. I think his upside is as a very good college quarterback who he needs to be able to see guys open. And what I mean by that is it's really easy to throw to Tyquan Thornton when he's got 2 yards of separation on somebody. And Blake is a guy who he can recognize that, pull the trigger, be accurate, be on time. And so when everything is flowing very naturally, Blake looks great. And I think what I saw over this past month is that, as Baylor closed out the year against their 3 best opponents, Kansas State, TCU, Texas, those are 3 very, very, very good football teams. I think their wide receivers and skill position, as we saw, Monterey Baldwin was playing really banged up. I don't think he would have been playing if Baylor had more depth at the receiver position. I think he was gutting it out just because he knew the team absolutely needed him. Gavin Holmes was hurt. Hal Presley's still developing. I think they really struggled with the fact that just receivers really struggled to get open. And I absolutely think that Blake could have played better. Obviously, he missed plenty of throws over the past month. But what my guess is what the staff is thinking going into next year is if we can just get some better receiver play and make it to where not everything is on Blake to make perfect throws every time, but just allow him to get in more rhythm with receivers getting open more often, I think they're betting that he's going to be the best guy to helm the offense going forward. Because I think, we saw, Kansas State has that cornerback number 23, Julius Brent, who's about to be an NFL player, and he just destroyed Baylor's wide receivers on the line of scrimmage all game. And I think we saw a lot of that against Texas too, where guys were just pressing up on him and owning him. And that's why most of the work they were doing was with Monterey Baldwin coming out of the slot, where he could play with with some space between him and the defensive backs. So anyway, I think the focus is going to be on getting Blake some better weapons, developing the guys they already have, and then hoping that with better weapons, he should be able to just be more consistent and play within a flow, as opposed to feeling like he has to do everything and put everything on him in the passing game.
There's a lot of staffs that still have to be filled out because only really head coaches being hired at this point. But how much are you eyeing this Baylor staff, and how much potential movement there could be there as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. One of the things I've been saying on the 365 boards for the past year is, I think Baylor really needs to expect Grimes to be leaving at some point, and Baylor fans should be hoping that he leaves, because it probably means that the offense is awesome and he's going to get a head coach job. That's just something I've been saying for a while. I think he's kind of destined to be a head coach. I don't know if the 6-6 record is hurting things there, and if it's going to be another year. Selfishly, I think it would be really good for Baylor to keep the offensive coordinator. But if he were to take a head coach job somewhere, that would obviously affect things with usually, coordinators, when they become head coach, they end up bringing along several of their assistants. So that would affect things. I think defensively, I expect some movement there, just purely because I think when you look at the stats, and I did this past week, obviously this isn't Dave Aranda's defense. This is Ron Roberts' defense. But really, if you look at Aranda's defenses over the past decade, this was the worst performance by the numbers since he was at Hawaii back in 2011. It was not up to par. And really, with guys like Apu Aika and Dylan Doyle up front and the talent they had on that defensive line, I think it was a big underperformance. And I think they're probably going to be looking at how can we get a better defensive back play? How can we just make this unit gel more as a whole? So, I don't really ever like to publicly call for anybody's jobs or anything like that. But like I said, it's very rare that you look at a staff in December and then look at them again in February and they're the exact same. And given how Baylor struggled in some certain areas this year, I'd be very surprised if it looked the exact same. So very anxious to see what happens on that front.
Hey, Travis, thanks for your time. We appreciate it. Travis Roeder, SicEm365.com, college football analyst on the Kyron Drones decision. Also moving forward with that, plus a lot. As Craig mentioned, Paul, you guys mentioned, go shopping. What would you do? What would you have? Kyron Drones, man, I tell you what, he looks